On. This is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burgis and Stefan Bertram, reunited again on a very, very raw stream imposed upon us by the evil Restream lords, who were refusing to take Jason's bank and lovely money despite him having it. And so we're now coming to you without a background image, without a video clip intro, and with us being forced to have a little Restream logo in the top right, much to my infuriation. And today we'll be talking about the capitalist class and culture and workers and stuff.
Wow. Yeah, I see. Really took some time to prep that intro. I like it. I don't know how
Yeah,
many.
I mean, I had a different one before I just started seething at fucking Restream.
I don't know how many drafts that went through. Before you got there. Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. Yes. This is a very fixable problem. Jason switched to StreamYard for most of what he's doing on TIR. And so now the kind of TIR account on Restream lacks many of the powers and capacities that it once had. But we will do this on StreamYard next week, and it will be a much more professional operation.
I mean, past this point, it's all the same apart from the Restream thing. And our background, instead of saying being black and saying this is revolution, it's just black.
Yeah, I don't love it. But
Yeah, there won't be an outro either. That'll be sad.
yeah. But yes, we will. We will do one of these next week. I am overcommitted to the point of madness. So don't get me wrong. Do expect a lot of stuff on solo shows in your near future. But when Stefan asked if I wanted to do one today, my first thought was, we should do the taking the red pill essay because out of the recent essays, that'd be the fun one to do. But actually, the one that came up today, the one that went up today, would also be good for one of these streams. So we can do that next week. That's the Curtis Yarvin thing. But
yeah, I mean, I think of your essays, it was probably this one that I found kind of the most analytically useful or whatever in terms of models of thinking and so on.
Yeah. So this is about, in a sense, it's about Vivek Chibber's book, the Class Matrix, and which is, I think, a really good and really useful book that came out. I don't know, at this point, it's like a couple of years ago. I want to say like 2022, but it's also a response to another essay that was written about this book by William Clare Roberts, who is maybe better known as the author of Marx's Inferno, the Political Theory of Capital, which is a book that I've definitely got some pretty large criticisms of parts of, but I don't want to overstate the case. I think it's a good book. I think there's some very worthwhile elements of it.
Cool
and
name.
yeah, definitely start in there. It's a cool name. And he's a good writer, and I think he's one of those people that it's like, when he's right, he's very helpful. When he's wrong, he's very wrong. But in any case, I was originally aware of Roberts through that book, right, through Marx's Inferno. But I should say, for larger context, I mean, I've also become aware of him as a commentator on intra-left stuff in the last couple of years, and
Always an
that's
unfortunate position to be in.
yeah, that's a context where I'm much less fond of almost anything that he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to be an honourable man engaged in such a business. Ultimately, I think someone needs to do something about it, but I think it's a struggle,
Yeah, yeah. So I should say, for example, and this is like, I think you can kind of see it on the edges of what we're talking about today, although it doesn't, directly overlap. Um, he wrote a essay for Crisis and Critique, like, I don't know, a year or so ago, called Class in Theory, Class in Practice, which is dedicated to accusing people like Chibber and Adolf Reed, and not to put too fine a point on it, me, of the I am cited as in one of the footnotes as an offender, of the sin of class abstractionism, which is, I'm tempted to say is 2025 for class reductionism, right? That the terms,
Right.
the terms keep getting updated. Roberts and McCarthy and Stefan, who are the other people who've written about this, would argue that it's very different. But in any case,
And I mean, I feel like my entire life has been a series of people saying that we focus on class too much, apart from maybe like a brief period around 2016, 2017. And notably, this was also happening before I was born. And it just seems like this is kind of a never ending series of demands which have no end or any clear kind of when they could
yeah,
consummate.
I mean, and there is something. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole for too long, right? But I mean, there is something interesting to be said here about trying to figure out exactly what the worry is. That, because the sort of classic charge, class reductionism. I mean, in fact, I think part of the reason that Roberts, McCarthy, and Stefan move towards different terminology is that they realize that this is sort of this kind of doesn't make sense on its face, right? Like, if certainly, I mean, maybe this is just context inappropriate, but what I'm used to reductionism meaning in like philosophy context is that you're saying that like one phenomenon actually turns out to just be like nothing over and above another phenomenon, right? Like, so
Like
classic example.
brain is the mind, and the mind is the brain.
Yeah, exactly, right. That minds are nothing above and beyond, above and beyond brains, right? The sort of JCC smart, mind brain identity theory. It's kind of extreme version of reductionism about the philosophy of mind, or like you have in philosophy of science reductionism about the special sciences, where you say that like there are actually no laws of biology or chemistry or whatnot that don't just reduce to like fundamental physics, right? That they have like that's the kind of claim that you're making there. And it just seems like, well, whatever class reductionism was ever supposed to make, it clearly can't be that, because like, I mean, one, it just doesn't seem like, even on the face of it, any of the people who are supposed to be class reductionists are doing that exactly, right? And then two, even if they were, it's not clear that be politically relevant one way or the other. I mean, like, if you said, that, oh, I don't know, instances of racism are actually just sort of reducible in this sense, right, to instances of like economic structures working out, that by itself wouldn't tell you anything about like what we should think about political strategy or what to do about racism or any of that, right? I mean,
Right.
that would just be irrelevant. I mean, it's like, yeah, somebody who believes that mental states are nothing above and beyond brain states doesn't therefore care about suffering less than somebody who thinks that mental states are like ontologically distinct, right?
Right. Like you could be someone who thinks that, race ultimately reduces down to class, but still be like a black nationalist because you think that's like the
Totally.
best strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, this is, yeah, you could have any strategy, right? I mean, it's like, this is like just saying that like, oh, I think that like, racial categories are some sort of like disguised form of class categories or whatever. It's like, okay, but like, even if so, right? I mean, in a way, actually, that kind of sounds like not the sort of thing that like the people who are usually accused of class reductionism think. that sounds like the sort of thing that thinkers who are often liked by people who throw around the accusation think, like the Stuart Hall, right? Race is the modality in which classes lived. That actually kind of sounds like reductionism in the literal sense, right? But again,
Well, I think
it's
the accusation of class reductionism normally rather implies like, I feel like this person doesn't talk about my thing enough.
totally right. So I think that what people are really getting at when they say it is it's a normative issue. It's like, oh, you don't care enough about this non-class stuff, and which is a little frustrating when you hear that, because it's like, at this point we're sort of doing an inventory of the soul, right? Like, like does it turn out that deep down,
I really do care about black people deep in my heart. I promise.
yeah, exactly, it's sort of an unwinnable fight there, but which is why I'd much rather talk about the stuff that's sort of publicly available to talk about, which is, okay, I mean, there's no real way to peer into somebody's heart and figure out if, how much they care about it. But if what they're saying is, I think that strategically, the thing that would be the most helpful for in fact improving the situation of members of various marginalized groups, would be focusing on class and material equality, right? Then it just seems like it would be much more helpful to just have an argument about whether that's true, kind of bracketing the intentions of people who make the argument, which is always the source of frustration about this. And yeah, I think the class abstractionism stuff is like a little bit more complicated, but it's a classic Walter Block callback there, which I should say, by the way, new Walter Block debate dropping in a few weeks. But in any case, yeah, it's so the class abstractionism thing is well, more abstract, but I think it does kind of boil down to something of the same issue, right? That like what it's supposed to consist of is illegitimately inferring the political primacy of class from its like structural explanatory primacy, right? That's what class abstractionism is supposed to be, and it's again, it's like, okay, I guess it's an improvement over reductionism in the sense that it's like, it just seems like less of a non sequitur, like taken literally, but also it's like reductionism in the sense that it's like, well, I don't really see a lot of evidence that any of the people who are accused of this are actually engaged in the specific reasoning that they're being accused of. And it's also like it in the sense that it's like, well, we're just not engaging with the strategic argument, right? Like this is really what I'd like to focus on is the because like, yeah, I mean, I wrote an article for Jacobin that's in the footnotes of the William Clare Roberts class abstractionism essay that's called "We Need a Class War, Not a Culture War," and it's unclear to me whether he read the article or not, or he was just kind of harvesting
Didn't
articles
like
that
the
had
title.
headlines that sounded like the kind of thing he wanted to criticize. But if you read that article, like it's not an abstraction from the structural primacy of class and explaining capitalist society or anything like that. It's just a very boringly straightforward strategic argument, right? So yeah, all of which is just kind of context, and I think maybe not entirely. Yeah, I think it's at least not entirely irrelevant, because I think that it does sort of situate some of the politics of this debate. But of course, the essay, and this does come up, right? I mean, this is I sort of say at the beginning. I mean, part of the reason I wrote this, I've maybe been thinking I'd eventually write something about this, but when I actually a couple days after I saw you in person in November, I was at the Historical Materialism Conference in London, and I went to a session on this book of essays that just came out about Eric Olin Wright. like, oh, fantastic, a little bit of analytical Marxism at HM, which is lots of very very non-analytical Marxism there. So was excited by that, and but then one of the speakers had this little jab at Vivek Chibber in his book, The Class Matrix, in his his comments, and I sort of took took issue with that in the Q&A, and we ended up talking a little bit after the session broke up. And in the course of all that, right, he was like, "Oh, well, have you read William Clare Roberts' like review essay about the class matrix, taking the red pill?" And it kind of brought home to me that I think this has been a very influential response to Chibber, and it's maybe worth engaging with. I had read it, I don't know, shortly after I actually read the Class Matrix, and I sort of complained about it in the group chat, from the with the
Yeah, I mean,
people I'd heard about.
in the essay, you seem decidedly unimpressed.
Yes, that's fair. Again, I do think Robert's virtues are on display. He's a very good writer, etc. But yes, I'm very unimpressed with the
Well, I
core
mean, it
argument.
seemed from the thing where he failed to kind of grasp what Chibber was actually saying. And at that point, if you don't grasp it, it doesn't really matter how good of a writer, how good of a philosopher, or what you say isn't going to be that much of good, because you're just kind of missing the point. You're tilting against what. Like, you can make a brilliant argument if it's not against the right text, like the actual text which exists, then it's not very good an argument against the text.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think he does ultimately miss the point. So, should probably say what the point is.
Yeah, I was going to
That
say, like, because I think the most interesting bit of the essay is you going over Chibber
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the bit review.
So right. So Chibber, this book, The Class Matrix: Social Theory After the Cultural Turn, is a like the Chibber's project in this book is to talk about is to think about how to sort of do materialist class analysis in ways that sort of take on board and take seriously the reasons why so many academics who in some genealogical sense come from that tradition
Mm.
have stopped doing that, right? So like it's very, one way of thinking about this is like, look, here's a very easy way of continuing to do like class analysis after all that stuff. Just like, denounce those people as petty bourgeois idealists and just keep doing what you were doing, right? Like that's I mean, this is the way that, like, I don't know, if you're reading like a book of, like if you're reading like a pamphlet about this, put out by like the Socialist Workers Party or whatever, like that's what they would do, right? And that's, even if you think it's correct or whatever, that's like maybe not ultimately that interesting. I think it's way more interesting that Chibber, at least by his lights, you could argue that, he doesn't succeed or whatnot, right? But like Chibber is at least trying very hard as he understands it to intersect with the serious reasons why, academic theorists, cultural theorists have turned away from this kind of materialist analysis that assumes that economic structures can have a certain kind of explanatory primacy in helping you understand what's going on. That it's not that they have they're not just sort of that at the very least it's not downstream from culture, right? That like we can analyze stuff like the capitalist class structure, really that's the example that interests him, right? Capitalist class structure independently of an analysis of sort of cultural specificity, and we can make predictions about how people are going to act based on it, and so on, right? Like, um, and so there are, you know, when he says the cultural turn in the title, I think he really means a couple of things, because he's interested in sort of answering different objections to doing this kind of analysis that he wants to do, right? So one of them is this roughly the set of worries that motivated the first generation of, you know, Frankfurt School theorists, which is roughly something like, okay, Marx thought on the basis of his, you know, economic analysis of the world that the dynamics of capitalism were going to radicalize the working class into overthrowing the system. And, you know, when's that happening, right? You know, that you know, we, you know, I mean, God, actually, when some of these guys are first starting to write, it hadn't even been that many decades, right? Since
Yeah, like 70 years.
yeah, it's been a real long time now, right? So it's like, you know,
Whole
whatever.
human lifetime.
Yeah, right. So, but yeah, already started to get a little impatient. You know, when's this proletarian revolution that you're predicting coming? And they basically thought, okay, the fact that it hasn't happened is some reason to think that the original analysis is missing something. You could say the original analysis is missing something in the sense that it's just like the original analysis is just like wrong, right? But you know, this sort of early Frankfurt stuff wasn't going there. It was saying, no, like this is all basically correct, right? The economic interests of workers would in fact be served by doing this. But given that, and the fact that they don't, we clearly need to bring in something outside of economic analysis to explain why not. You know, we need to think about like culture and ideology to, you know, to explain the lack of revolution, right? That's like their basic move. And then there are later theorists who have much deeper objections to traditional materialist analysis. That, you know, because like, you know, guys I was just talking about roughly, and I know I'm flattening some complicated intellectual history here, but I mean, I think in broad strokes, what I just said is like fair enough, right? As far as those guys go, right? Yeah, very true to us. Yeah. So
Sorry,
yeah.
Joe, I you out there.
No, all good, all good. Just thinking about feudalism there. In any case, um, yeah. But the other critique he wants to engage with goes a lot deeper, right? It's not just like, oh, this is incomplete because you need to supplement your analysis of class structure and all that with this theory of culture and ideology. It's, hold on, are you even entitled to think that class structure, that, you know, economic, you know, structure is something that exists independently of culture and ideology? And the second group would say is, well, if you think about this, you can't really participate in a structure of any kind, right? If you don't, if you haven't like antecedently assimilated the right cultural scripts that, you know, that you know, people use phrases here like you know, meaning orientation, right? You know, so and again, I really want to emphasize that in both cases, there are all kinds of rhetorical moves like an old school Marxist could make to just be like, you know, silly thing to say, right? And he's not doing any of that, right? Like he actually takes this stuff very seriously. He's, you know, and he spends a fair amount of the time in the book trying to sympathetically unpack what the concern is, right? So he's got like this, analogy at one point where he says, look, I mean, to kind of get what people are saying about, having to have the right meaning orientation to participate in the structure, think about like a church, right? I mean, if you just, drop people, into a church service with no context, for what's going on, right? They're not gonna just participate in that, right? You have to have some sense of like, the role of the priest versus the congregation, how you're supposed to act in a church, like all of that stuff, or else.
Well, of course, people in medieval times could understand exactly what to do despite not understanding any of the words said.
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah, you didn't need to know the actual words. Nobody in the congregation would know the actual words, right? But you still knew when to stand and when to sit, and when to take communion, and how to take communion, and all of that stuff, right? So yeah, exactly, right. So he does make a sort of snarky point that's like, well, he's not rested on this, but I mean, it sort of motivates, his attempt to recover, kind of materialist analysis. Is like, look, there is something a little bit funny about the fact that these concerns about whether economic structure could possibly be something that exists independently of culturally contingent meaning orientation became popular among like lefty academics during precisely the decades in which like capitalist class structure was just metastasizing at a crazy rate throughout all kinds of different parts of the world with totally different local cultures, and not being hindered in the slightest, by any of it, right? Like, I mean, that should suggest that you're
Right. I mean,
missing.
it happened at the exact same time as like global village ideas, right?
Yeah, yeah, right. So that's yeah. So I think that so his answer basically, this is not exactly the way he puts it in the book, but I think it's a fair summary of what he says, and I've got him over email since I wrote the essay saying yes, this is accurate, right? That I think a fair way to summarize his sort of core response to both of these sets of worries is to say, okay, we actually don't need to go looking for something outside of the kind of traditional Marxist analysis to explain this. It turns out that like conceptual tools that are already here can do more work than was typically appreciated by either side of these debates, right? So, when it comes, and in particular, the kind of core point, about like, okay, so you think about capital. Marx is obviously trying to do way more than this in Capital, but like two of the big things he's trying to do, right, are to argue in opposition to bourgeois apologists that capitalism is in fact a class system, the way that feudalism was a class system, right? It's a it's, even though if you're only thinking in terms that derive from the sphere of circulation, capitalist labor markets seem, like he says at the end of chapter 6, the very Eden of the rights of man. If you dig a little deeper, that there are actually these relationships of domination and exploitation, but then also is trying to think about what makes capitalism different from previous from systems of domination and exploitation. And this is, to a certain extent, Marx fighting with other critics of capitalism, right, who he thinks missed the point. And like the sort of core difference, from Marx's perspective, in how the basic labor relationship works. I mean, there's also the difference, of course, that capitalists are in market competition. So they have with one another, right? So they have this tremendous incentive to try to squeeze more labor out of people all the time that like the exploiters in previous systems really didn't have because they were just kind of exploited for their own personal consumption. But says the sort of core difference is that workers don't have to be directly coerced in under capitalism, right? That there's no that like in other words, he spends a lot of time in Capital describing like nightmarish factory conditions, but nobody had to be like marched at gunpoint to the factory gates in order to experience these conditions, right? And this is
Yeah, and that didn't even happen during like Stalinist USSR or whatever, right?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I think there are points in the Stalin era when in some ways it got close to that, but yeah, that's that be you'd need permission to switch jobs and have absenteeism, would it's in the criminal code, stuff like that. But for the most part, yeah, right. I mean, that wasn't
And
really what
for the Nazis, obviously did it to their slave class, but not for
yeah,
normal humans.
yeah. Yeah, right. So look, nobody. I mean, this is the point that this is a point that Soren Mao makes in his book Mute Compulsion. Which I've got some issues with that book, but this is but one of the one of the good lines in the part I read was he was talking about Foucault. And, Foucault has all this stuff where he's writing about the ways that people are disciplined in various kinds of institutional settings, ranging from, Victorian madhouses to, very, progressive education to blah, 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 right? And in the course of that, Foucault's got this whole thing where he's like writing about factory codes. But I mean, Mao points out, it's like, okay, but if you're reading Foucault here, like you'd sort of lose sight of why it is that people show up and subject themselves to this in the first place. Right, you would almost get the impression that it was like against the law not to go to work, and of course, it's not, right. It doesn't have to be, right. That the difference between a feudal serf who does have to be directly coerced into working the Lord's fields for a certain number of weeks a year, and a modern proletarian is that the feudal serf can support himself without, right, can support himself independently of that subordination. He has his own little plot of land, whereas the modern proletarian doesn't have a little plot of land, right? So they can't do it, right? So this is all of which is just to say that like the sort of most immediate difference between the production relationship, capitalism versus previous kind of class societies, is that even though Marx thinks that workers are under compulsion, to go to work for capitalists, it's a mute compulsion, right? Because they're being compelled by the as the dull compulsion of material necessity, right? And so Chibber basically thinks mute compulsion can pull much more explanatory weight in explaining both of these sets of concerns than is typically appreciated either by the theorists he's arguing against, of course, right, or by people just sort of doggedly defending Marxism without really getting into this point. Because the way to see this, I mean, maybe starting with the bit about meaning orientation, is look, yeah, it is true that all structures, including economic structures, right, that involve complicated relationships between people, that you can only participate in them, right, if you've internalized the right cultural scripts, the right meaning orientation, right. You have to know how you're supposed to act at work, and respect the supervisory authority of managers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't actually make it, this is Chibber's point, terribly culturally contingent whether people are going to be able to adjust to capitalist class structure, because
They have to.
They have to, right? Exactly, right? There's like, well, if you're going to internalize a certain meaning orientation, or you won't be able to eat, it's not really culturally contingent whether you'll do so or not, right? Like that's you're going to so to reverse the classic Upton Sinclair line, about how it's very hard for a man to understand something if his income depends on his not understanding it. Well, it's very easy to get him to understand something if his income depends on him understanding it, right? Uh, and so I think that uh, it turns out, right, that this is, there is a sense in which you can say, like, if you think of like different kind of cultural scripts, meaning orientations as games, you can play, that, yeah, sure. um there are lots of games that it's sort of contingent on, if not your personal choice, then at least the choice of like the culture that you're in, whether or not you're going to get off the shelf and play. But the goofy analogy I used in the essay is like, this one's Jumanji, right? It's going to make you play it. And and then as far as the why hasn't there been a revolution kind of concern, or sort of more generally the idea that we need culture and ideology to explain working class non-resistance, Chibber argues, well, no, this is actually kind of exactly backwards. The class structure itself can do a fine job of explaining working class non-resistance, because if you're just sort of thinking about like what's in the material interests of workers as a collectivity, then this seems real mysterious, right? It's like, yeah, why don't they just rise up and seize the means of production? Whereas if you're thinking about what material interests a worker singular has by virtue of their position in the class structure, then it's extremely non-mysterious why they don't do this, right? Because as a matter of fact, even doing things like joining a union, never mind, I don't know, picking up a rifle and, marching on the Winter Palace to demand all power to the Soviets, is incredibly risky, right?
And that's assuming there's even a union in the first place, right? Like, if you're the
Right.
first guy who's like, let's make a trade union, then you're first out the fucking door.
Yeah, of course, right? I mean, this is, yeah, absolutely. Like,
Yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is that they even came into formation in the
existence at
first
all,
place, right?
totally,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, because like it's very much, yeah, successful class struggle is in the interests of a particular worker, but most class struggle is not going to be successful, and
Yeah.
unsuccessful class struggle is very much not in the interests of the worker. Uh, and yeah, exactly what you just said is kind of Chibber's core point. It's like, no. Given, like, if we're sort of zooming in closer than, to be fair, Marxist theorists sometimes do, right? Like, and we're sort of thinking about, okay, by virtue of the very story that you are telling about how class structures work, right? What does that predict about the incentives and behavior of individual workers under normal circumstances? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, compulsion compels, right? You are in fact going to have every incentive in the world under normal circumstances to keep your head down and go with the program and not resist, right? So, working class non-resistance doesn't require culture and ideology to explain it. In fact, Chibber thinks this is the wrong way around. Working class resistance is the anomaly, right? I mean, that's what requires explanation. And in fact, that's where it's useful to bring in culture and ideology. And I listened to Cale Brooks interviewed him about, it wasn't about the book, but it was related, about on a recent episode of the Jacobins, the new podcast it does in Jacobin, Confronting Capitalism. And Chibber had a nice line in that interview about how sometimes he'll give talks about this stuff, and the most pushback he'll get is from organizers, right? Because he'll say all these things about how people are going to be predictively incentivized to be relatively cautious and about what strategies to pursue and so on. And of course, if you're an organizer, that means that you're in fact very self-sacrificing, right? It says it's like yeah, but like what he kind of tries to impress on people is like yes, and look, thank God, right? I mean, if we didn't have those people, we'd be really screwed. But like, also you've got to recognize that you're the weird one, right? That's
Yeah,
like
yeah, you're a guy with a special interest hobby thing going on there, like, and it's great that you
yeah,
do, but
yeah, exactly. Very important that you do, but like, yeah, it's not like you are psychologically anomalous there. Most people are not going to think like that, predictably, most of the time, right? That so, which doesn't, it's not a counsel defeat, right? It's just saying that in fact, right, if participating capitalist class structure, right, if that game is Jumanji, um, engage in anti-capitalist class struggle sadly is absolutely not Jumanji, right? I mean that's not a game that's going to force you to play it, right? That one is in fact quite contingent whether it happens or not, right? That we have to, that it is a question of, again, culture and ideology are going to come up here in big ways. And and what you have to think about is, okay, how do you go about building a solidaristic culture? Because again, most people most of the time are going to predictably be very motivated by kind of immediate material interests in ways that not like a sort of very abstract, what's the interest of my entire category of the population, but in a concrete, immediate way, what's in the interest of me and my family, that is not going to be served by taking big risks. So it's, you have to have, like, again, I mean, the good news is that it still does happen anyway, right? I mean, it's not like it's not like there are no successful workers movements. It's clearly possible. It's just very difficult, and in order to do that, you have to, immediate material interests are still going to have to do a ton of the heavy lifting, but
right. I
you know,
mean, and obviously, this is a great thing about trade unionism because even if very often in the UK, still like the top leadership of trade
uh,
unions will be communists, like the recently
sure,
retired RMT guy. Um, but obviously, he's not like, oh, so next week we'll be storming Parliament, and then the week after, blah blah blah.
yeah,
Like 8.7% wage increases this year, boys. Let's go.
totally right. And that's the whole dance of this. That's like, okay, you need to ultimately, like, you need a sort of initial lift from culture and ideology, right? From solidaristic culture building to get to the point where you can accomplish fucking anything. But that's not, again, given most people's predictable individual interests and incentives, like there's only so far that can take you. You need to put points on the board in a way that changes the calculation of individual self-interest, right? That like, oh, we actually uh actually we're well enough organized now that I'm not worried, that if I participate in the next strike, I'm just gonna be in the gutter, right, as a result of it, right? That and
Right. I
I
mean,
think
if you think striking is going to be a losing proposition, and you aren't like deeply in kind of like the culture that say like 1980s UK miners did, then of course you'd be
yeah,
like, nah, mate, I'm all right.
yeah, right, of course, right. So
But this
uh
again, you're like a really weird, freaky guy.
yeah, no, yeah, absolutely, right. And again, I think this is often very hard for people who, frankly, almost anybody who's even interested in being in this discussion, it's going to be very hard for them to internalize this point because we're all weird, right?
Yeah.
But um, But yeah, most human beings in general are are just not that ideological most of the time. I mean, that's just that's in fact, this is something in my experience that's like online leftists perpetually have trouble remembering, right? That like it's not like it's not like the world is divided between us and then people who are strongly committed to like other ideologies. Right? That's like most people are just not super political creatures. It's a bit of a niche interest under most circumstances in most societies. I mean, even people living under much more extreme forms of oppression, right? That's still going to be true, right? That I mean, God, I mean, even if you you know, I mean, even if you live in Gaza or something, right? That the number of people who are going to like dedicate their lives to the liberation movement versus the number of people who would prefer to spend most of that time thinking about girls and soccer, right? Is going to be,
Or even people that are like incredibly like patriotic and so on. Like I was watching a
sure,
video
yeah,
from Gaza where there was some guy who's being interviewed, like when the Qasim brigades come out to do their like we're still
yeah,
here for his big thing,
right,
and he was going, he was wild for them, and he was basically saying like, as a civilian population, we're going to stay in our homes and get blown up and killed, um, so that like it's easier for our guys because they're our guys. But he still wasn't like I'm going to join Qasim because he was just a normal
yeah,
guy who, by
right,
kind of doing his ordinary life, was taking to be supportive of them.
yeah, and even that, of course, is a level of dedication that it's like, yeah, you have like protracted struggle over many decades under like almost unfathomably extreme circumstances, right?
Right. I
Never
mean,
mind.
famously, people say about Hamas that they didn't do armed struggle for like 30 years because they were like an Islamic. They wanted to Islamize, for the worst, they wanted to Islamize Palestinian culture and destroy its secular, like largely, popular communist and socialist character before they would do that armed struggle. But of course, as an organizing model, they were wildly successful.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and yeah, there's a whole, uh, yeah, uh, which yeah is really, I mean, honestly, I think is kind of a world historic tragedy that like all that like yeah, there's still the PFLP or whatever, but it's like you know by and large any kind of secular socialist resistance in Palestine has just been totally wiped out because the people with the sort of resources and connections and and long term organizing successes to weather the storm, right? Are various kinds of Islamists or various kind like various kinds of factions that are being supported by some outside group, which would obviously for the last 30 years not include the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, the
Uh,
only place that it didn't take place in the Middle East and obviously across various places in the world was Turkey Kurdistan, which is notable because both the kind of the Kurdish freedom movement and the Turkish
yeah.
military are like the two major secular forces left in the Middle East, and they're engaged in a constant death struggle.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's like so the end result of all this in the Palestine case is that it's like you have one of the most extreme forms of oppression and kind of brutality, right? In the colonial project that exists around the world, but the politics of it are sort of hopelessly muddled by the lack of that kind of resistance force, right? That they, like the sort of analogy I always think of is like it's like if the ANC had been defeated or co-opted, so the main armed force that was continuing to fight apartheid South Africa was some like hideously reactionary group of black nationalist Christian fundamentalists.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Right?
like just evangelicals that do exist, like evangelical terrorist groups that exist in the Congo or whatever.
Yeah, totally right. Then it's like, yeah, it would still be it would still be just as correct to be a Western anti-apartheid activist under those
Yeah.
circumstances, but it would become a much harder political lift for obvious reasons, right? And this parallel thing is true. But yeah, look, so point is that I that there is that in fact, Chair's point is, what's structurally guaranteed by the dynamics of capitalist class structure is people, ideologically, internalizing, what they need to, and in terms of, cultural scripts and whatnot, and most people under most circumstances keeping their head down, trying to pursue individual level strategies that are less risky, for improving their lot. And what's unfortunately not structurally guaranteed, right? What's quite contingent is building the sort of solidaristic culture that you need to help along and realign material incentives in ways that get people to that that get people to engage in resistance against the system. And I think the sort of most easy and obvious go-to explanations are at the level of the workplace and labor unions. But a point I tried to make in the essay is, you know, like, because, for example, right, the guy I was arguing with in London, like, definitely took this as like Chibber being like, oh, that's like the only site of struggle or whatever. It's like, no, parallel points are going to apply across the board, right? I mean, like that, any kind of, whether you're thinking about, labor unions or electoral campaigns, or, in times and places where change happens this way, marching with rifles on the Winter Palace, right? Like whatever, right? Like this is in all of these cases, right?
We're very
This
ecumenical.
yeah, the same dynamics are going to apply, right? That you have this built-in structural incentive for non-resistance, and to overcome that, yeah, exactly. To overcome that, there is this long, difficult, very non-automatic process of building up solidaristic culture. Um, and the point is not, right. I think people can get mixed up about this. The point is not, oh, so we're saying that like workers are going to overthrow capitalism just out of pure like moral commitment. Right? It's like, no, right. There's the material interests still have to do most of the heavy lifting, right? It's just that once you kind of zoom in on individual material interests and realize that unfortunately this is much more complicated than it looks if you're just thinking in this very abstract way about what's in the material interests of workers as a whole, then yeah, you have to get people, like, that's why, right, those communist union leaders aren't sellouts for being like, oh, all right, guys, we're going to get that 8.7% this year, right? Because I think they have a correct understanding on some level, right? That's the only way to win, right? The only way to like be in a position to win, major victories, that you like, I don't know. I mean, if we want to even think about like social democratic things like, universal health care in the U.S., or, I don't know, take your pick, renationalizing the railroads, whatever you guys have going on there, right? Like, you're not going to be in a position to do that stuff, right? Until you've built up, you've changed the balance of class forces, and you're not going to be able to do that without like a lot of like long, slow grinding on
Yeah, and RMT is notable in the UK because they have a higher percentage achievement rate of those 7.9s.
yeah, right. And it's like, look, man, if you're frustrated listening to this because it's like, oh, well, it sounds like it's going to be really long and really hard, and there's no guarantee that I'm going to win. Then, I'm sorry if you're hearing this for the first time.
Yeah,
But
on questions of like, why hasn't revolution happened yet? I'm always reminded of that Sopranos meme. You know the one where he's like, "You don't feel like nothing good is ever going to happen to you." And I'm like,
And then it
"Yeah,
didn't.
no, yeah, like so what? Like, of course, that's to be the revolution. Like, why would it have happened? Like,
Right.
and the thing with Marx is like, oh well, he thought it would happen soon. It's like, yeah, but like, he's not the Kisak Hadaract. Like,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
fact
yeah,
that
yeah, exactly.
Marx didn't like predict the time and place of the revolution doesn't really matter to me. What he identified was like the general trends.
Yeah, right. I think there's like a brilliant analysis of the general trends combined with also, he's like an immediate political participant, right? That
Yeah, I mean,
he's
obviously, like, it's nice to say it'll happen in your lifetime.
yeah. I mean, it's his being has obvious reasons to be optimistic and I think a lot of our reasons now for being a little pessimistic about the timeline are like induction from what's happened for a very long time
Yeah.
already, right? Whereas like yeah, Marx, I mean, was living at a time where you really have the first stirrings of this stuff, right? So it makes
Yeah, I mean,
sense
they
then.
lived through basically the kind of the reintroduction of working class self organization, which in some ways had never really existed in history, depending on how you take it. Like, depending on how you take, like, guilds.
Yeah, basically, right? I mean, this is like, I mean, if you go, I mean, I was just looking at today, Adam Smith, in the Wealth of Nations, he has this passage that up until the last sentence sounds almost like something that Marx could have written
Mm.
about how about why about why masters is the phrase he's using at that point, right? Capitalists almost always win in struggles over wages, and he's and so like Adam Smith's just like, yeah, well, I mean, obviously, combinations are against the law, right? That's
Mm.
it's like in like every capitalist country in the world at the time he's writing, you just take that for granted that it's like that's the sort of you know I mean, that's like sort of what we would mean by union, but I think that that's probably like attributing way too much institutionality
Mm.
to what anybody had in mind, right? That it's just like you know workers combining together, to insist on higher wages. Adam Smith just kind of takes it for granted that it's like, yeah, obviously the law is going to prohibit that, and this is yeah, I mean, so you don't have like even anything that looks like unions. It's like, up until not very many decades, certainly before Marx comes along, is going to be very rudimentary and like universally illegal. And
Yeah, and often the forms of like working class organization were like groups that would like try to pogrom Catholics.
sure, yeah. Uh, and yeah, and then people, and then certainly the idea of like socialist or communist political party. I mean, even political parties like sort of existed, sort of didn't. It's and like you get the earliest, uh, yeah, I mean the earliest stirrings of people even thinking of themselves as socialists are again not that long before Marx and Engels come along. I mean, I guess you have like you go back to like the late stages of the French Revolution, and you have like a few cranks around the edges. It's like Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals, but it's still not really clear that that's exactly what we would mean, right? But it's like sort of proto-communist kind of, that
I mean, there's a lot of like beautiful land of lemonade stuff.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, right. Like but yeah, even stuff like the Owenites and all that was like very recent developments, right? At the time that he's writing, and so certainly the sort of fusing of the stream of some kind of rudimentary working class organization with this like weird utopian socialist speculation is like just happening at that
Yeah.
time, right? So like I think under those circumstances it makes sense to be very optimistic then it's like, okay, see, this is starting to catch on, and we're gonna like then we're gonna be off to the races. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's not, as it turns out, right? I mean, it's like, look, if I you're never going to go broke betting on the house, and at any given point, if you're like, if you just had to make a rational bet, right, is the are the powers that be going
You
to
should
preserve
invest in the stock index, basically.
yeah, right, it's yeah, it's like, again, it's very it's difficult. It's contingent. There's zero guarantee of success. But I mean, I think maybe kind of going back to where we started talking about you know the accusations of class reductionism and class abstractionism and all of that stuff. Um, like, it remains the case that, yeah, you have this like incredibly narrow aperture through which you could conceivably have uh, have a successful movement to reorganize the basis of society, because you have all these people who have this shared, whose interests would be served by doing so, right? Again, if you realign those interests in the right way through doing all this stuff, whose interests would be served by doing so, and who have the capacity to do so, because their numbers and their ability to shut down the economy and all that stuff, right? So it's like, yeah, that is a long, winding, narrow path that most people fall off of most of the time, but it's also the only fucking path. I mean, there's no like, what's the, I mean, there's always this kind of vague insinuation that I'll see all these like academic Marxists who don't like this be like, well, somehow or another, if we lean into particularism and third worldism and identity stuff or whatever, somehow or another over the course of time, this is going to like dialectically jujitsu its way into like socialist universalism. And it's like, I don't, I don't know, man. I want to hear more about what the steps would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's about chasing the dragon.
Yeah, yeah, very much so.
Um,
Um,
Before the
yeah,
Gaza war, I didn't really like the idea of a subaltern, or whatever they're called. But now,
yeah,
after seeing like by the end of the war, a large amount of the munitions that Hamas were using were American bombs dropped by the Israelis, which hadn't gone off, which they then recycled into weapons to then kill the Israelis. I was like, okay, the subaltern does exist, but I'm really not expecting to see the revolution out of them.
yeah. I mean, sure. Yeah, I mean, if you just kind of want to chase after whatever the most marginal, the most oppressed thing in the world is, um, I mean, that scratches a certain kind of psychological itch, but I mean, like, that's kind of the opposite of what you want to do if you
No,
want to think about like
I like the
what
proletariat because they're the big, strong class with lots of people in it.
yeah, exactly, right? It's like, well, if you want to if you actually want to change the world, right, then what you need to think about is who has the numbers and capacity and all that to do so, right? And how you can mobilize them, and that's like, this is why my yeah, the tweet that has that got me the most hate from left Twitter probably in the last year was uh, read more Marx and less Fanon, and you know, but like, I don't know, it still seems like good advice to me, I have to say. um,
I mean,
like,
it's not like Fanon wasn't doing that.
yeah, well, that's true too, right? But it's like, yeah, I think that, but I think that if you have this, and I mean, I think there's like a nuanced view that you can have about Fanon that's like reasonable, but like, also, but I do think that there's this sort of obsession with the aesthetics of the kind of anti-colonialist violence that he's describing, and to
Which
a certain
is
extent,
now clearly historical, right?
yeah, yeah, right, yeah. I mean, in overwhelming majority of cases is clearly historical, and so. but like, people, I think that they're not wrong to say that Israel Palestine is the place where that's like continues to be the most relevant, right? That's true, right? But like, I think that people really underestimate the degree to which going around saying that like anybody who's a settler, which by the way includes all of you people that I'm talking to, is like basically illegitimate, is not a winning strategy. Like that's
I
want.
mean, I don't want to say this is actually the case because I don't want to kind of speculate about what happened to these hostages over the past 18
Sure.
months. But from watching those videos of the hostages being released, it seemed that Hamas are much nicer to them than like people on Twitter.
uh, wow, that's dark. Yeah, I think. I mean, look, it could be. I'm sure there's like. I don't want to like overstate the case because like I'm quite sure that we'll be hearing like many
Yeah, no, I mean,
stories.
I've got the exact same feeling. Just on also being treated nicer, seemingly by like the Zionists on Twitter, who seem very disappointed they've got the hostages back.
Well, that they. I mean, do you see Ben Shapiro reassuring his followers on Twitter that the war was going to restart, and it's like, don't worry, guys, the
Yeah, bro,
murder will
like
continue.
2 weeks we'll be back. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry.
Exactly. So I think that anyway, I realize that in what we've said, I kind of set up the basic
Yeah,
political
we didn't
valence.
actually get to Roberts, but it's fine.
Yeah, the sort of
I found
political
that
valence
releasing.
of like the kinds of disagreements I have with Roberts, and then we got to Chibber's picture, and we didn't really get to Roberts' criticisms of Chibber's picture, or why I don't think that they go through. But I guess we could just say, read the essay.
Classic. I'll link it again. The good thing about us being about TIR and GTA being on the same thing instead of one being linked is that I have access to both chats, and so I can actually post in
Oh,
both of them.
nice.
Yeah.
That is good.
So the chats, well, they haven't been integrated for the people reading them, but for me, they've been integrated. There's no
Yeah.
distinction at all on the right side. Like some of those are from your side. I think most of them are. Actually, probably most of them aren't. But you've got more viewers than TIR at the moment.
Yeah. And sorry, that reminded me to look at the chat. And I do see Tony Red points out, and I was actually kind of thinking about this as we were talking about this. You can find, of course, antecedents going back much further than the French Revolution. I mean, the English Civil War. You've got the, various kinds of like extreme leveler factions and stuff like that who are saying very proto-socialist kinds of things. But that's all true. But
Yeah.
and whatever. I mean, like you can go, you can go back to Plato, who was certainly not anything like a socialist, but he does say in the laws or whatever, the Athenian stranger, right? Plato's mouthpiece says in the laws that, when he's giving advice for what the laws should be when you start a new city from scratch, so you're not weighed down by tradition, says that if one citizen accumulates more than 5 times as much wealth as any other citizen, you should be able to go to court and get it taken away from them because that's too much inequality to maintain a sense of community.
But I mean, that's the ultimate point, right? That like what's important is not the utopian musings of any particular man, but
Yeah,
rather
of course.
socialism and communism, whatever, is the real movement of the working class, not anything else.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like you have. I think this comes to much the same thing, right? But to like maybe frame it a little bit differently, like there are any number of people since like fucking forever who've like looked around the world at the existence of extreme wealth and extreme poverty and sort of registered the feeling that there was something really
Damn, that's
wrong with
fucked,
this.
bro.
What's that?
Damn, that's fucked, bro.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, this is like that has been a very common reaction that like human beings have had, uh, you know, at all sorts of times. And, some of them have been philosophers and so they've written about it,
But
but
reasonably, if you lived in any mode before the capitalist one, obviously you can say like, oh, it'd be good if society was more equal, but you can't really say, well, there should be prosperity for all because there just wasn't enough stuff.
yeah, yeah, right. So I think that definitely limits the sort of imagination that people had about what there could be instead, and you don't really have. I mean, you don't really start to have. I think people seeing. Yeah, I mean, like, and actually, yeah, I mean, even somebody like Rousseau, right? I mean, he's definitely a you know, damn, that's fuck, bro, guy about inequality, very, very much so, right? But in some ways, I mean, that's even linked to this kind of asceticism, right? It's like, well, maybe it's okay if we don't have that much to go around, so we can avoid this, because yeah, it's very hard to see how like how in pre-capitalist societies you could have something that's more communal or even just more equal, and not just have that be the equality of crumbs, and then also I think that it's very telling, right? So this is my last year. Uh, One of the articles from last year that I like them, that I was most proud of was a review of this book. This is the greatest of all plagues: How economic inequality shaped political thought from Plato to Marx by David Leigh
Mm.
Williams. And you know, one of the things that really hit me reading that book, is that it's like, yeah, I mean, you've got all these people who's chronicling over the course of thousands of years, sort of looking at economic inequality and not liking it, right? But you don't really start to get people thinking about power inequalities within the production process until like the 19th century. Right? I mean, this is so you have like John Stuart Mill, for example, uh, who's you know certainly doesn't have any conception of like class struggle as a way to
Mm.
achieve a more equal world or anything like that, right? I mean, like it is a
He's still kind of on the it would be nice kind of thing. Or maybe I'll
yeah, yeah,
vote for it myself in Parliament.
yeah, yeah, totally, right. And but you start to get Mill saying stuff like, uh, "There's something really demeaning about work relations that some people have to submit themselves to the domination of other people to make a living, and at the very least, wouldn't it be
Right, like
nice?"
seeing the inherent kind of tensions with bourgeois ideology and bourgeois society.
Yeah, right. I mean, so this is so I just started this last week doing this in person version of the Capital class in LA, and in there, right.
Where do you do it physically? Like what kind of venue?
It's well, actually, we'll see if we have to switch, because
Mm.
the room was pretty crowded, but it was but the venue that we're doing for this, so it's in Koreatown, which is pretty close to me. It's anybody who's watching wants to show up next Wednesday. It's Cafe Mak, MAK, uh, and so it's basically this like little this it's basically this like little room that's like kind of off in the back of the coffee shop. That's like I
Oh,
think
like
kind
a
of
hired venue room.
yeah, I think it's kind of there for like again it's pretty small, right? But but it's like I don't know. I don't really know what kind of events people usually do there, or if it's just kind of something that people reserve, just like a study
Mm.
room or like what. But
You
you
can't
know,
book a university room.
Uh, maybe. I don't know. This I really like the location if we could make this work.
Yeah.
But yes, we were talking about chapter one. We were talking about the Aristotle part in chapter one. Near the end. Uh, and
We've talked about like 6 times in this show. We love talking about that.
yeah, exactly right. People know what I'm talking about. I can just say the Aristotle part, right? And in and I'm trying to remember the exact comment from a student about this, but it's like the basic point they're making, which I think is totally correct, right? Is think like, okay, well, what's you have like part of the difference between like ancient Athens and Victorian England, uh, in terms of why the kind of ideological blinders on what's thinkable, are much more severe in ancient Athens, than they are in Victorian England, where Marx is writing, is that, you know, if you're post Enlightenment, you've got this like official sort of reigning bourgeois ideology that says that everybody's free and equal, and like, so that really does open up space for like noticing the contradiction between that and the way your society is actually organized. Whereas, like, I don't know, ancient Athens, nobody's like pretending to believe that if people are free and equal. It's like, it's like nobody thinks that.
Right. I was going to say it's kind of a shame that probably next week we'll be doing Curtis Yarvin. Well, I find the feudalism essay very interesting, but of course,
Huh?
Curtis Yarvin is arguing for monarchism.
That's true. It's true. If you want to do the feudalism essay, we could just be 2 weeks behind. I'm fine
Hmm.
with that, but we'll figure it out.
Well, I mean, I'll read it and I'll see if it. I might be just being
Yeah,
tempted by the title and I don't actually like it.
fair enough.
So yes, probably. Well, definitely something on next week. We're back to our stuff unless LA is consumed by fire again or blah 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 external
Sure, sure, sure.
circumstances.
But yeah, we'll do, unless something changes. I am expecting to do something. To do some sort of stream next Sunday.
And that will be all because the
We
stream will
can't
end
do we
very
can't do outro music
brutally.
right now.
There's no outro music, and yes, yeah, unless you want to like play it through your phone, or I want to go like do 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 do. So we will just in a second very brutally end this stream. So goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.